Dust motes danced in the silence of the garage, settling on cold chrome and forgotten promises. 10-year-old Leo traced the eagle emblem of a 1948 Harley-Davidson panhead. His mother was upstairs, gasping for breath, dying. By dusk, he would trade this legendary iron for her life, unknowingly waking an army. Sweat beaded on Leo Mitchell's forehead as he stood in the doorway of his mother's bedroom. The Vallejo, California heat was unforgiving that August, but Sarah Mitchell shivered under 3 layers of quilts. Her skin held a translucent, waxy pallor, and every breath she drew sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. Stage IV lupus nephritis had waged a relentless war on her body for 2 years, and the expensive immunosuppressants keeping her organs from total failure had run out 3 days ago. "Water, sweetie," Sarah whispered, her voice barely registering above the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock. Leo fetched the water, his small hands remarkably steady as he held the glass to her chapped lips. He was only 10, but the prolonged absence of his father and the rapid decline of his mother had forcefully stripped away his childhood. Arthur Mitchell, known to the streets and his brother simply as Artie, had succumbed to a massive heart attack 3 years prior. Artie hadn't been a businessman or a lawyer. He was a fully patched member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, a man whose laughter shook the floorboards and whose loyalty was legendary. When Artie died, the club paid for the funeral, an impressive procession of roaring engines that stretched for 2 miles. But as time passed, the visits grew sparse. Men with rough lives and dangerous roads naturally drift, assuming the widow and her boy were holding out fine on the life insurance. They weren't fine. The insurance had been drained by the American medical system within 18 months. Downstairs, a final notice from the pharmacy sat on the kitchen counter. $1,200 for the next month's supply of medication. To Leo, $1,200 might as well have been $1 million. He had emptied his piggy bank, scoured the couch cushions, and even tried to sell his baseball cards to a kid at school, amassing a pitiful $34. Walking out to the detached garage, Leo stared at the one thing of value they had left. Sitting under a canvas tarp was Artie's pride and joy, a flawless, custom-built 1948 Harley-Davidson panhead. Its cherry red paint job gleamed even in the dim light, accented by intricate, hand-painted gold pinstriping. Etched discreetly near the speedometer was a small 81, the numerical representation of Hell's Angels. It was a museum-quality piece, a rolling piece of outlaw history easily worth upwards of $40,000 to the right collector. Sarah had sworn to starve before selling it. It was Leo's inheritance, the physical embodiment of his father's soul. But Leo didn't need a ghost soul. He needed his mother to breathe. Leo knew a man who bought motorcycles. Greason Briggs owned Motor and Pawn on the seedy edge of town. Grayson was a thick-necked, sweaty opportunist who had always looked at Artie's bike with a hunger that made Sarah uneasy. Getting the 600-pound machine across town was the first hurdle. Leo marched over to their elderly neighbor, Mr. Caldwell, who owned a rusty flatbed tow truck. Lying through his teeth with a composure born of sheer panic, Leo told the old man that his mother had finally arranged to have the bike tuned up at Briggs' shop to sell it properly. But she was too sick to drive behind the tow. Pitying the boy, Caldwell loaded the heavy panhead onto the flatbed and drove it, the 5 miles to the pawn shop, dropping it off with a sympathetic pat on Leo's shoulder before driving away. Greason Briggs stood in the gravel lot of his pawn shop, a cheap cigar clamped between his yellowed teeth. His eyes widened as he recognized the cherry-red panhead sitting in his driveway. He looked around, expecting to see the imposing figure of an angry biker. Instead, he saw a 10-year-old boy in a faded t-shirt clutching a piece of paper. "Well, I'll be damned," Grayson muttered, circling the bike. He ran a greasy hand over the leather seat. "Artie's ghost ride." "Where's your mom, kid?" "Sick," Leo said, his voice hard. She needs medicine. It costs $1,200. I want to sell the bike. Grayson stopped, his predatory instincts flaring. He knew exactly what the bike was worth. He also knew the unwritten rules of the streets. You do not touch a dead Hell's Angel's property, and he certainly do not fleece his widow. But greed is a powerful anesthetic to common sense. Grayson looked at the desperate, sweating boy, then back at the pristine chrome. Kid, this is an old bucket of bolts, Grayson lied smoothly, shaking his head. Market's terrible for these post-war clunkers. Parts are impossible to find. Best I can do is $1,000. And I'm doing you a favor, considering the towing fees I'll have to pay to get it to an auction. I need $1,200, Leo insisted, stepping closer. Plus money for groceries, $1,500. Please, mister. Grayson pretended to mull it over, masking his internal gleeful laughter. All right, kid, $1,500. Cash, because I respected your old man. 10 minutes later, Leo was running down the cracked pavement of the industrial district, a thick envelope of $100 bills clutched desperately to his chest. He didn't look back at his father's motorcycle, now being wheeled hastily into the darkest corner of Grayson's warehouse. All Leo cared about was the neon green cross of the pharmacy 2 blocks away. The screen doors slammed shut, echoing through the quiet house. Leo sprinted into the kitchen, his lungs burning, and ripped open the white paper pharmacy bag. He poured a glass of water, practically flying up the stairs to his mother's room. Mom, wake up, Leo urged, shaking her frail shoulder gently. I got them. I got the pills. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. She saw the familiar orange bottle and the glass of water. A mix of confusion and profound relief washed over her features as she dry swallowed the 2 large pills, gulping the water down frantically. It took 10 minutes for her breathing to ease, the color returning marginally to her hollow cheeks. She leaned back against the pillows, her gaze sharpening as it settled on her young son. Leo, Mr. Henderson at the pharmacy, he finally gave us credit. Leo looked down at his worn sneakers. No, Mom. Sarah's eyes drifted to the bedside table. Sitting next to the water glass was a stack of remaining $100 bills. 3 of them. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Leo, where did you get that money? The silence that followed was suffocating. Leo's lip trembled. I sold it, Mom. I sold Dad's bike to Mr. Briggs. A guttural sob ripped from Sarah's throat, a sound of absolute devastating horror. She didn't cry for the money, or even the loss of the physical object. She cried because she knew the streets, and she knew her late husband's world. Artie's panhead wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a relic of the charter. The club's crest was practically ingrained in the steel. By letting it fall into the hands of a scumbag like Grayson Briggs, the family had unknowingly committed a sacrilege. Oh, my baby, Sarah wept, pulling Leo into her chest as the boy finally broke down in tears of exhaustion. You didn't know. You were just trying to save me. But Grayson? He stole it from us. He robbed a dead man. Across town, Grayson Briggs was too busy celebrating his own genius to realize he had just lit a fuse to a bomb. Unable to contain his excitement, he took 3 high-resolution photos of the panhead and immediately uploaded them to an exclusive, password-protected forum for high-end motorcycle collectors. His caption read, "Just acquired a local legend's ride for pennies on the dollar. Needs a new home far away from California. Bidding starts at $30K. Grayson thought he was being discreet. He thought he was untouchable behind a computer screen. He was incredibly wrong. In a smoky bar in Oakland, 40 miles away, a man named Jax was mindlessly scrolling through his phone. Jax wasn't a fully patched member of the Hells Angels, but a hang-around and associate desperate to earn his prospect patch. He also worked part-time sourcing vintage Harley parts, which gave him access to the same underground forums Grayson used. Jack stopped scrolling. The cherry red paint, the distinct, hand-painted gold pinstriping trailing down the fender. And there, just barely visible in the third photo, the faded 81 etching. Jax's blood ran cold. Every affiliate in Northern California knew that bike. Without a word, Jax stood up, leaving a half-empty beer on the counter, and walked straight to the back room of the bar. Two massive men in leather cuts flanked the heavy oak door. Jax nodded respectfully. "I need to see Reaper. Right now. It's about Artie Mitchell's ghost ride." Inside the dimly lit room sat Cole Reaper Stanton, the president of the Vallejo Charter. Reaper was a mountain of a man with a graying beard and eyes like cracked flint. Artie had been his sponsor, his mentor, and the godfather to his daughter. When Artie died, Reaper had stood over his grave and sworn a blood oath to watch over his legacy. Jax handed his phone across the felt-covered poker table. Reaper stared at the screen for a long, agonizing minute. The silence in the room grew so dense, it felt like physical pressure. The other patched members at the table, Bones, Silas, and Dutch, watched their president's jaw, clenched tight enough to crack molars. "This is Grayson Brake's shop," Bones noted, leaning over Reaper's massive shoulder. "Sleazy pawnbroker down in the flats. Artie's widow wouldn't sell that bike to a rat like Briggs," Reaper rumbled, his voice dangerously low, like the distant thunder of an approaching storm. "Not unless she was bleeding out on the floor. Or worse, Briggs took advantage of them." Reaper slowly stood up, the leather of his cut creaking in the quiet room. He picked up his own phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. It rang 4 times before a weak, exhausted voice answered. "Hello, Sarah? It's Cole," Reaper said, his tone softening only slightly. "Tell me exactly what happened to Artie's bike." Through tears, Sarah explained everything. The illness, the cut-off medication, Leo's desperate act of love, the flatbed tow, and the pathetic $1,500 Briggs had handed a 10-year-old boy for a piece of club history. When Reaper hung up the phone, the atmosphere in the back room shifted from quiet tension to pure, unadulterated menace. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a tantrum. He simply looked at Bones, his sergeant at arms. "Briggs robbed Artie's kid to fence his ghost ride," Reaper stated coldly. "Make the call. Empty the clubhouse. Call the Oakland boys, too." "How many, boss?" Bones asked, already pulling out his phone. "All of them," Reaper replied, walking toward the door. Within an hour, the streets of Vallejo began to tremble. It started as a low vibration, a rumble that rattled coffee cups on kitchen counters and made stray dogs howl. Then came the thunder. From highways, from back alleys, from neighboring counties, they converged. 200 Hell's Angels clad in black leather and denim, riding in perfect, intimidating formation. The noise was deafening, a mechanical symphony of wrath tearing through the quiet Sunday afternoon. Traffic stopped dead. Pedestrians backed away from the sidewalks, watching in awe and fear as the endless river of motorcycles rolled past. They weren't just riding, they were hunting. And Grayson Briggs had nowhere to hide. Inside his cramped, unair-conditioned office, Grayson Briggs was pouring himself a celebratory glass of cheap bourbon. The digital clock on his desk read 4:15 p.m. In less than 3 hours, he had managed to flip Artie Mitchell's vintage panhead to an anonymous tech billionaire in Seattle for an astonishing $38,000. An enclosed, unmarked transport trailer was already parked in the back alley, its heavy hydraulic ramp lowered to swallow the stolen piece of outlaw history. Grayson raised his glass to the dusty ceiling, offering a mocking toast to the desperate 10-year-old boy who had practically handed him a winning lottery ticket. Then the floorboards began to vibrate. It started as a subtle hum, a frequency that rattled the pens on Grayson's desk and made the amber liquid in his glass tremble. Grayson frowned, setting the drink down. Vallejo was earthquake country, but this didn't feel like tectonic plates shifting. This felt rhythmic, intentional. The hum escalated into a deep, guttural roar that seemed to swallow all other ambient noise in the neighborhood. Grayson walked to his barred window and peered through the grime-caked glass. His breath hitched in his throat, and the blood drained instantly from his face. Rolling down the narrow industrial avenue was a tidal wave of polished chrome, black leather, and unbridled fury. It wasn't a dozen riders. It wasn't 50. 200 fully patched Hells Angels were riding two abreast, completely locking down the street from sidewalk to sidewalk. The afternoon sun glinted off the modified exhaust pipes and the menacing deathhead patches adorned on their backs. They moved with terrifying military precision, a unified front of modern cavalry descending upon a single target. Grayson stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of pawn ledgers. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. He scrambled for the heavy iron safe tucked beneath his desk, his trembling fingers repeatedly missing the combination dial. Outside, the roar crescendoed into a deafening mechanical scream before suddenly cutting out. 200 engines were killed in unison. The ensuing silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise. Heavy leather boots crunched against the gravel lot. The front door of Briggs Motor and Pawn didn't just open. It was kicked violently off its hinges, the deadbolt splintering the door frame into jagged wooden teeth. Cole Reaper Stanton filled the doorway. Behind him stood Bones, Silas, Dutch, and the sharp-eyed hang-around Jax. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. The sheer physical presence of the men, radiating a dark, suffocating authority, was enough to make the air in the room feel hopelessly thin. "Mr. Briggs," Reaper said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that offered no warmth and promised zero mercy. "You've been conducting some unauthorized business today." Grayson held his hands up, backing himself into the corner of his office until his shoulders hit the cheap wood paneling. "Look, guys, I don't want any trouble. I run a legitimate business here. People bring me things. I buy them. That's the law of commerce." Bones, a man whose knuckles were covered in thick, faded scar tissue, stepped forward, grabbing Grayson by the collar of his sweat-stained shirt and hoisting him onto his tiptoes. "You think you're talking to the Better Business Bureau, rat? You bought Artie Mitchell's ghost ride from a 10-year-old kid. You exploited a dying widow. I gave him a fair price." Grayson choked out, his eyes darting frantically toward the back door. $1,500 for a $40,000 piece of club history, Reaper stated, stepping closer. He reached out and casually swiped Grayson's glass of bourbon off the desk. It shattered on the floor, the sound making Grayson flinch violently. "But that's not the worst part, Grayson. The worst part is that you knew whose bike it was, and you thought we were too blind or too stupid to notice." Reaper nodded to Silas and Jax. "Check the back." The two men disappeared through the bead curtain leading to the rear warehouse. Grayson's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what they would find. 2 minutes later, Silas returned, his face a mask of cold fury. "Bike's out back, boss. Halfway up the ramp of a transport trailer." Driver took one look at our cuts, tossed me the keys, and ran down the alley. "But Reaper, you need to see this." Reaper walked through the warehouse, stepping out into the blinding afternoon sun. There, resting on the steel ramp of the trailer, was Artie's beautiful 1948 panhead. But as Reaper approached the speedometer console, his jaw locked. Grayson, in his haste to make the bike presentable for a wealthy civilian buyer, had taken a mechanical buffer to the chrome. The sacred 81 etching the mark of the Hells Angels had been partially ground down, leaving an ugly scratch scar on the pristine metal. To an outsider, it was property damage. To the club, it was an unforgivable desecration of a fallen brother's memory. Reaper walked slowly back into the office. Grayson was still pinned against the wall by Bones, weeping openly now, a dark wet stain spreading across the front of his trousers. "You tried to erase him," Reaper whispered, stopping inches from Grayson's face. You tried to grind Artie off his own iron. Please, Grayson sobbed. I'll give the bike back. I'll give you the 1,500. Just let me live. Please, you are going to live, Grayson. Because killing a pathetic cockroach like you isn't worth the paperwork, Reaper said smoothly. But you are going to pay a stupidity tax. Who bought the bike? Some guy in Seattle. Wired the money an hour ago. How much? Bones growled, tightening his grip. 38,000. Grayson wheezed. Reaper pointed to the iron safe under the desk. Open it. Bones dropped the pawnbroker. Grayson scrambled to his knees, his bloody fingers fumbling with the dial until the heavy door clicked open. Inside were stacks of banded cash's entire operational liquidity, plus the freshly withdrawn wire transfer from the Seattle buyer. Bag it all, Reaper ordered Dutch. Dutch produced a heavy canvas duffel bag and swept every single $100 bill from the safe into it. He didn't bother counting. It was easily over $50,000. That's my business, Grayson cried, watching his life savings disappear. That's everything I have. No, Grayson, Reaper corrected, leaning down so they were eye to eye. That is Sarah Mitchell's medical fund. The bike goes back to her boy. The money goes to her doctors. And if I ever hear that you've set up shop within 500 miles of Vallejo again, or if you ever whisper the name Mitchell to a single soul, I won't send 200 men to your door. I'll just come myself. Do we understand each other? Grayson nodded frantically, violently, his chin hitting his chest. Reaper stood up, adjusting his leather cut. Roll out, he commanded the room. Within minutes, the transport driver's keys were tossed down the storm drain. Silas and Jax carefully backed the panhead off the trailer. Jax swung his leg over the vintage leather seat, kick-starting the engine. The old Harley roared to life, a deep, uneven rumble that sounded like a resurrected beast clearing its throat. The 200 riders mounted their bikes. At Reaper's signal, the deafening symphony of iron and exhaust erupted once more. They left Briggs' motor and pawn in ruins, a broken door swinging in the wind, carrying their reclaimed ghost ride back to where it belonged. 4 miles away, the Vallejo suburbs were quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of lawn sprinklers. Inside the Mitchell house, the atmosphere was thick with dread. Sarah lay in her bed, clutching the orange prescription bottle like a lifeline. She had spent the last 2 hours weeping, convinced that her son's desperate act of love had cursed them. She knew the Hell's Angels. She knew the fierce, uncompromising loyalty they held for their patches, their bikes, and their dead. Downstairs, 10-year-old Leo sat on the bottom step of the staircase, a battered aluminum baseball bat resting across his small knees. He didn't fully understand what he had done wrong, but his mother's terrified tears told him that Grayson Briggs wasn't the end of their problems. Then he heard it. It was faint at first, a vibration that made the glass in the front windows hum. Leo gripped the baseball bat tighter, his knuckles turning white. The hum grew into a roar, shaking the floorboards beneath his sneakers. Outside, Mrs. Gable from across the street dropped her watering can on the pavement, rushing to her porch as the horizon filled with an endless procession of motorcycles. They turned onto Elm Street, a parade of dark leather and gleaming chrome that stretched further than the eye could see. The neighbors watched in stunned silence, peering through parted blinds and cracked front doors. The convoy slowed, the deafening noise echoing off the quiet suburban facades until they completely surrounded the Mitchell property. Leo stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stepped toward the front door just as a heavy, rhythmic knocking sounded against the wood. Taking a deep breath, the 10-year-old boy unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, raising the aluminum bat an inch off the ground. Standing on the porch was a giant of a man with a graying beard and eyes like cracked flint. Behind him, parked squarely in the center of the driveway, was his father's cherry-red 1948 panhead. Sitting on the bike was a younger man, keeping the engine idling softly. Reaper looked down at the boy, then at the baseball bat in his trembling hands. The corners of the fierce biker's mouth twitched upward in the ghost of a smile. "You gonna swing that aluminum at me, little man?" Reaper asked gently. "If you're here to hurt my mom, I will," Leo said, his voice shaking but his stance unwavering. "I sold the bike. I did it. She didn't know. Don't punish her." The heavy silence on the porch was palpable. The surrounding bikers, hardened men who'd seen the worst of the world, watched the 10-year-old boy stand his ground against their president. A ripple of profound respect washed through the ranks. Reaper slowly lowered himself onto one knee, the heavy leather of his cut creaking, until he was at eye level with Leo. He reached out and gently placed his massive, scarred hand over the barrel of the baseball bat, lowering it to the floor. "I'm not here to hurt your mother, Leo. My name is Cole. Your dad used to call me Reaper," he said softly. "Artie was my brother, which makes you my nephew." Leo blinked, the defensive tension slowly draining from his small shoulders. "You brought Dad's bike back." "We did," Reaper confirmed, "because a rat like Greason Briggs doesn't get to own a piece of Artie Mitchell. But I need you to listen to me very closely, Leo." Reaper placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "What you did today, walking into a snake's den to sell your most prized possession just to keep your mother breathing, that is exactly what your father would have done. You didn't betray his memory by selling that iron. You proved that you have his heart. A machine is just a machine. Family is blood. You acted like a man today." Tears welled up in Leo's eyes, the crushing weight of the day's guilt finally lifting off his chest. He threw his arms around the giant biker's neck, burying his face in the rough leather shoulder of Reaper's cut. Reaper hugged the boy back, his massive hand patting the child's back defensively. After a moment, Reaper stood up and looked toward the stairs. Sarah, draped in a heavy blanket, was leaning against the doorframe, weeping silently. Reaper walked inside, pulling the heavy canvas duffel bag from his shoulder. He unzipped it, revealing the neatly banded stacks of $100 bills, and placed it gently on the hallway table. "Cole, what is this?" Sarah whispered, staring at the unimaginable sum of money. "This is the Greason Briggs stupidity tax," Reaper said plainly. "There's over $50,000 in that bag, Sarah. It's yours. Clean and clear. It covers the $1,200 for the medicine, the hospital bills, and groceries for the next 5 years." "I can't take this," Sarah cried, shaking her head. The club failed you," Reaper interrupted, his voice thick with regret. "When we buried Artie, I swore to look after you both. I let time and the road get in the way. I let this boy think he had to carry the weight of the world by himself. That ends today." Reaper turned to the doorway and whistled sharply. Jax, the young man who had ridden the panhead back, jogged up the porch steps. "Sarah, Leo, this is Jax," Reaper introduced him. "He's the one who found the bike online. He's got a good eye and a loyal heart." Reaper unbuttoned a small pouch on his belt and pulled out a curved, embroidered patch that read, "Prospect." He handed it to Jax, cementing the young man's initiation into the Brotherhood right there in the Mitchell's hallway. Jax nodded respectfully, his chest swelling with pride. "Jax and Silas are going to be stationed outside your house for the next month," Reaper told Sarah. "They'll run your errands, pick up your prescriptions, and make sure nobody bothers you. If you need anything, you tell them. You are club family, always." Reaper turned back to Leo, ruffling the boy's hair. "Park that panhead back in the garage, kid. Throw a tarp over it. When your legs are long enough to reach the pegs, I'll come back and teach you how to ride it. Promise?" Leo asked, wiping his eyes. "Angels swear, kid," Reaper smiled. Reaper walked back out to the street, mounting his own massive, customized Harley. He gave one final, respectful nod to Sarah in the doorway, then raised his right hand in the air. 200 engines roared to life in perfect, terrifying harmony. The street vibrated one last time as the massive convoy slowly rolled out of the suburbs, leaving behind the distinct smell of exhaust, burning rubber, and salvation. Leo stood on the porch, watching them disappear into the setting sun. He walked over to the driveway, running his hand over the cherry-red tank of the panhead. It was no longer just a relic of the past, gathering dust in a lonely garage. It was a monument to his father's enduring legacy, and a heavy, chrome reminder that in the darkest of times, they would never ride alone. The streets of Vallejo eventually quieted, but the echo of 200 engines remained etched in the asphalt. Leo Mitchell learned that day that true inheritance isn't measured in vintage chrome or engine displacement, but in the fierce, unconditional loyalty of the brotherhood his father left behind. The panhead now rests safely in the garage, a silent guardian wrapped in canvas, waiting for the boy to become the man.